Now let's start adding the building elements. I like to start with walls, so let's start by adding a wall type. The selections available to you will depend on the attachment type for the property. For example, if you have a detached dwelling, you'll get the option of external wall, internal wall and no new value. Whereas if you have a dwelling that is attached, for example semi-detached, mid-terrace, end-terraced, enclosed mid-terraced or enclosed end-terraced, you'll get the option of party wall as well. If you select external wall, the calculator will prompt you to enter the age band for that wall and its construction type. Once you've selected the relevant age band and wall construction, you are prompted to complete the additional insulation drop-down. Should the wall be in its original state and it's an original construction, select none. Should additional insulation have been added since construction, select the appropriate from the drop-down list. It is important to remember that the calculator uses assumed U values for the walls based on their age band and construction type, so only select additional insulation if insulation has been added since construction. For example, a solid brick constructed wall constructed during band A pre-1900 with 100 mm of external insulation will have had its insulation added after construction. The data for building elements is derived from RD-SAP, so for example, should you select timber frame construction, you will only be able to select internal wall insulation as you're unable to enter a depth for that insulation. Furthermore, if you have a solid stone wall with internal or external insulation, select solid brick or stone for your wall type rather than solid granite whinstone or solid sandstone limestone. This will enable you to add additional insulation. When you enter internal wall, the calculator will ask for the construction type of that wall. The four options available to you are aerated block, breeze block, solid brick and stud partition. Select the most appropriate wall type from the list. If you're unsure on the wall type, as it is often difficult to tell an internal wall, I'd recommend selecting the worst case scenario. Obviously, if the wall sounds hollow when tapped, timber stud should be selected, but if it sounds solid, it's likely to be solid brick unless the wall is constructed from the 1980s on. Solid brick are the worst performing walls in terms of U values for masonry type walls, so if it sounds solid when tapped and you're unsure, select solid brick. If the dwelling is attached, a party wall option will appear. The options available are unknown, cavity filled, cavity unfilled, solid brick and system built and timber frame. Finally, in the walls section, if you have a wall where you have a measured or design U value, this can be entered by selecting the known U value category. You can also enter a thermal bridging if you wish, and if the wall is a basement wall, instruct the software if it accounts for good ground contact. Moving on to floors. Here you'll enter all of the floor types within the dwelling so that they can be added to the appropriate rooms later on in the calculation. The options available will depend on the dwelling type and are ground floor known insulation, exposed floor, internal floor, party floor and known U value. If you have a floor that sits on the ground and you do not know what insulation is present and there is no insulation or there is no insulation at all, select ground floor. From here, you can give the floor a memorable name such as ground floor no insulation or solid for example, or stick with the suggested name in the calculator. From here, select the floor construction of that ground floor, which will either be solid concrete if it sits on the ground, or if it's off the ground, it will be suspended timber, chipboard, beam and block. The age band of the floor is based on the RD-SAP age bands. And finally, the wall construction that is connected to the floor will need to be selected. If you know what insulation is present in the ground floor, you need to select ground floor known insulation from the category section. As previously mentioned, select the appropriate floor construction type. This time, however, you'll be required to enter the insulation thickness in millimetres and wall thickness in millimetres. So remember, if you are visiting site to produce your calculation, that you make a note of these measurements. Both measurements cannot be more than 999 millimetres, and should the property have a floor that separates a dwelling from an unheated space, so say for example a garage, exposed floor should be selected. Once again, the age band of this floor must be selected. As with all floor types, if you're unsure, go with the age band of that building part. Following that, the thickness of the floor insulation must be selected. As built, and unknown are available as they are directly imported from RDSAP. Where it would be essential the correct option is selected if you cannot see insulation in RDSAP, in Heat Loss Calculator either can be selected, as it will default to the level of insulation installed as per the building regulations of the age band selected for that floor. If insulation is present, you can either select 50, 100 or 150 millimeters. Should you have an internal floor, the process works much in the same way as previously described. Select internal floor from the category list, give the floor a name, or of course you can accept the default given, and then finally you will need to select one of the two drop-down options from the menu for internal floor construction. If you do not know what insulation there is, or if there is less than 100 mm, select intermediate unknown less than 100 mm of insulation. Or if there is more than 100 mm or 100 mm of insulation, select intermediate equal to or more than 100 mm of insulation. And then moving on, if you have a flat or apartment or a masonette, you will have the option to enter a party floor from the category list. This is a floor that separates the dwelling from a neighbouring property, i.e. if you have a flat that is above another separate flat. The floor of that flat you are assessing would be entered as a party floor. Once again, choose a name for the floor and then you will be prompted to enter the party floor construction type, and if it has any insulation present. These options available to you are timber uninsulated, timber 100 mm of insulation, timber 150 mm of insulation, concrete uninsulated and concrete 100 mm of insulation. As with the walls, if you have a measured or designed U value, you can select a U value from the category list. Enter the U value, and if it accounts for ground contact with a solid floor, if you know the thermal bridging factor, this can also be entered here too. Now we move on to ceilings. Here you'll enter all of the ceiling types in the dwelling so they can be entered into the relevant rooms later on in the calculation. You will have 4 options available to you depending on the dwelling type selected: external roof, internal ceiling, party ceiling, and of course known U value. If selecting external roof, you will be invited to give the roof a name, or you can use a suggested name. As I mentioned earlier, giving a building element its own name is really useful when it comes to building up your rooms later on. I think this is especially important for external roofs, as, for example, you may have one roof that is pitched with 100 mm of insulation and another which is a flat roof with 100 mm of insulation. Giving each element a defined name helps you avoid mistakes later on. As per the wall and floor elements, you will first have to select an age band for the external roof, and that's based on the RDSAP age bands. This will help determine the U values for that element. Then you must select the roof types. 3 options are available. Here it's pitched, slate tiles, flat roof or thatched roof. The insulation depth must also be entered with a maximum depth allowed of 999 mm. If you do not know the depth of the insulation or are unable to access the lot space during the physical inspection, the unknown box can be selected. Moving on to the external ceiling, which is of course a ceiling that separates different stories within the same dwelling. As usual, you'll be invited to give that ceiling a name, or you can go with the suggested name. Then the only other selection you will need to make here is the internal ceiling construction type. You will get this option of unknown, less than 100mm of insulation, or intermediate, equal to or greater than 100mm of insulation. Then, as previously discussed, if you have a known U-value or a designed U-value, measured U-value, you can enter it using the U-value category. You can also enter the optional thermal bridging factor. Moving on to door types within the dwelling. Here you'll enter all of the internal and external door types for the dwelling being assessed. The options this time are external door, internal door and no new value. Ensure you add all of your door types here so they can be used to build up your rooms later on. Pretty self-explanatory, but if you have a door that separates the dwelling from the outside, external door needs to be selected. As with all the other elements, you can give the door a unique name if you wish. You must then select the age band of that door. Once again, age bands for RDSAP are used here. You must then select if the door opens directly to the outside, or in the case of a flat apartment, if it opens to a heated or unheated corridor. Once again, the selection for internal door is pretty self-explanatory, and then this time there are 5 options to choose from. Solid wood 25% single glazed, solid wood 50% single glazed, solid wood 25% double glazed and solid wood 50% double glazed. And then moving on to known U value, which can be entered for your door along with the optional thermal bridging factor. So window types, the final building element to enter is the window type. Here you will enter all of the external and internal window types within the dwelling so you can build up your rooms later on. The categories are the same as doors: external window, internal window and known U value. Starting with external windows, as usual, you can enter your own window name if you wish, or go with the software suggestion. You are then required to enter what glazing type is present in that window, whether it's single glazed, double glazed, triple glazed or secondary glazing. Next, the frame type will need to be selected. This is basically the material the frame is made from. The options here are UPVC, metal or wooden. If you select double glazed as a frame type and UPVC, some further details will be required from you. Once again, these options are taken from RDSAP. You will need to confirm if the year the window was installed was pre or post 2000 and what the size of the glazing gap is. Options here are 6mm, 12mm or 16mm or more. If you are unable to tell what the glazing gap is, then it is recommended that 6mm is chosen if the gap looks narrow and 16mm if the gap looks wide. If the window is a roof window or on a flat or pitched roof, click the box. Don't forget, if you have 2 windows of exactly the same glazing type, frame type, year installed and glazing gap, if one is on the roof and the other is in a wall, you will need to create 2 window types. This is where your window name field really comes into play to enable you to distinguish between the two, which is essential as it will have an effect on the fabric heat loss. If you have an internal window, you need to select it from the category list and give it a name, or you'll stick with the suggestion. From here, it's simply a case of identifying the window as single, double or triple glazed. As you've become accustomed to, the U value for the window can also be entered, along with the optional thermal bridging factor by selecting U value from the window category.